What's going on, everybody? We're going to try to do a quick review of chapter 11 of the Autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley. Title of chapter 11 is Saved. Malcolm writes a letter to Elijah Muhammad in Chicago. Mr. Muhammad wrote back and said, quote, "The black prisoners symbolize white society's crime of keeping black men oppressed and deprived and ignorant and unable to get decent jobs, turning them into criminals," end quote. Elijah Muhammad told Malcolm to have courage, and he gave Malcolm $5. Malcolm's family always wrote to him and said, quote, "Turn to Allah, pray to the East," end quote. Malcolm says that his hardest test in life was praying. He says it took him a week to be able to bend his knees. He says the last time he bent his knees, he was picking a lock to break in somewhere. He says, quote, "For evil to bend its knees, admitting guilt, to implore forgiveness of God is the hardest thing in the world to do," end quote. Malcolm wrote letters to the people that he knew in his past to encourage everyone about Allah, Islam, and Mr. Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm says, quote, "The average hustler and criminal was too uneducated to write a letter, and the prison kept files on conversations with Elijah Muhammad and prisoners," end quote. Malcolm wrote to the Boston mayor, the governor of Massachusetts, and the president, Harry S. Truman. He told them how white man's society was responsible for black man's condition in North America. Malcolm became frustrated with his inability to express himself to Elijah Muhammad. Any education that Malcolm acquired is after 8th grade, came from prison or the Nation of Islam. He dropped out of school in 8th grade, so anything he learned after that came from what he learned in prison or what he was taught by Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. Malcolm says he was just going through the motions of reading, but not reading much. He says, quote, "The best thing he could do was get a hold of a dictionary to study," end quote. He began copying the dictionary, and this is in Norfolk Prison Colony School. He gains confidence as he reads his writing back to himself. He says, quote, "He started copying what eventually became the entire dictionary," end quote. Malcolm began to understand books more and began reading all the time. He says, quote, "I had never been so truly free in my life," end quote. The library had books on almost every subject, but he says they specialized in history and religion. Malcolm says, quote, "No university would ask any student to devour literature as I did when this new world opened to me of being able to read and understand," end quote. Malcolm says he preferred to read in the isolation of his cell. He hated when they would turn the lights out, but he would try to continue reading using a light in the hallway. He talks about jumping in and out of the bed every hour to avoid the correction officers on patrol. He says, quote, 3 or 4 hours was enough for me. So just sleeping 3 or 4 hours was enough. Other than that, he was trying to read as much as he could. He said Mr. Muhammad teaches how history had, quote unquote, whitened history. Basically, the white man telling the story instead of hearing the story from a black man's perspective. That's something that he learned. He says Mr. Muhammad taught Malcolm about the Negro and encouraged him to find books about black history. Malcolm mentions books like Wonders of the World, Will Durant's Story of Civilization, H.G. Wells' Outline of History, W.E.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk, Carter G. Woodson, Negro History, J.A. Rogers' Sex and Race, Findings in Genetics by Grenda Mendel. He talks about a quote by Arnold Toynbee, who was a popular writer at the time. He says, quote, "He has written that the African was the only continent that produced no history. Says he won't write that again every day now. The truth is coming to light," end quote. Malcolm says, quote, "He will never forget how shocked I was when I began reading about slavery's total horror," end quote. Says this was one of his favorite subjects. He read Uncle Tom's Cabin. He read about Nat Turner and the Nat Turner Rebellion. He read Herodotus, quote unquote, the father of history. He read how white men acted like devils, quote unquote, pillaging and raping. Will Durant's Oriental Civilization. Mahatma Gandhi's struggle with the British in India. And he talks about Christian, quote unquote, Christian traders not representing the true spirit of Christ. Malcolm says that he perceived how the collective white man was nothing but a, quote unquote, practical opportunist. Christians have used the labels heathen and pagans to validate their actions. Malcolm read how Britain infiltrated India in 1957 and how in 1857 the Indians mutinied. Malcolm says, quote, other than the African slave trade, nowhere has history recorded any more unnecessary bestial ruthless human carnage than the British suppression of the non-white Indian people, end quote. Malcolm talks again about the quote-unquote Christian trader whites, how they sent millions of pounds of opium to China, then they claimed the Opium War against China. At this time, Malcolm was writing to Mr. Muhammad daily. He says that he liked philosophy most. Well, he liked to read philosophy and read most of the old philosophers, both Occidental and Oriental. He says he preferred Oriental philosophers. He says, quote, most Occidental philosophers largely borrowed from Oriental thinkers, such as Socrates. He says the books became his alma mater. He says, quote, with every additional book that I read, a little bit more sensitivity to deafness, dumbness, and blindness that afflicted the black race in America, end quote. Malcolm asks, quote, how is the black man going to get civil rights before he can get human rights, end quote. Malcolm understood that after 400 years of blood and sweat, the black man in America was still begging for what immigrants got right off the boat. Malcolm says that prison allowed him to study more than if he would have went to college. So he felt that college would have been too many distractions, and prison allowed him to study 15 hours a day. He talks about reading about the founders on the philosophy of fascism, Schopenhauer, Kant, Nietzsche, and they laid the foundation for Nazi philosophy as well. He felt that they were arguing about useless things. He talks about the author Spinoza. He said that Spinoza impressed him. Malcolm liked the fact that Spinoza was black. He talks about how the, quote, white man's lives were falling apart, and, quote, how the black man had great, fine, sensitive civilizations before the white man was out of the caves, end quote. Malcolm says that little is known about the, quote, talents and civilizations and cultures that the black man and millions of the black man and millions. Let's do that again. Malcolm says, quote, the talents and civilizations and cultures of the black man a million years ago. The ancient civilizations of the black man have been buried on the black continent all the time. Malcolm says, quote, it's a crime. The lie that has been told to generations of black men and white men both, end quote. Malcolm says that there were two areas of expertise that have been extremely formative in his life while in prison. He says the experience of opening eyes of brainwashed blacks, and the other was the prison debate program. Malcolm says, quote, I loved so being around the white man that in prison he really disliked Negroes coming together so much, end quote. Malcolm began to use this as recruitment opportunities for Mr. Muhammad. He says that he had to be careful introducing truth to the black man. He had to tell them a little at a time and let it sink in. He explained how the black man would not know what tribe he is from and how most blacks wouldn't believe anything unless a white man said it. This was a conspiracy to keep the truth from the black man. Malcolm would watch the blacks. Malcolm would watch how the blacks reacted, and how some would go running to tell the white man, tell the correction officers and stuff. The American prison system's biggest worry was Muslim teaching to the black man. Malcolm says, quote, "The black convict is perfectly conditioned to hear the words, quote unquote, the white man is the devil." Black men in prison began to realize how the white power structure created an unfair environment. Malcolm felt that these men had the ability to be doctors, lawyers if they weren't in prison. Malcolm says, quote, "The white man is the devil" is a perfect echo of the black convict's lifelong experience, end quote. Malcolm was participating in weekly debates at Norfolk Prison Colony. He says, quote, "Had to start telling a white man about himself to his face," end quote. He says he never thought he would have been a speaker. He felt debating in prison was as exhilarating as reading. Malcolm liked the ability of convincing someone to his opinion based on study. He says, quote, "I put myself in my opponent's position and decide how I'd try to win if I had the other side. Then I figured a way to knock down those points," end quote. He talks about the disputes between the Ethiopians and Italians. He says, quote, "It was bombs that the Pope had blessed," end quote. He continues, quote, "It was right there in prison that I made up my mind to devote the rest of my life to telling the white man about himself or die," end quote. Malcolm mentions a debate about the identity of Shakespeare and his involvement in the King James Version Bible. Malcolm argued that King James was Shakespeare and used the Bible to enslave the world. Around this time, Reginald began to speak ill of Mr. Muhammad. Reginald was suspended by the Nation of Islam for improper relationship with the secretary. Malcolm wrote to Mr. Muhammad defending his younger brother, and that night he prayed to Allah for relief. It says the next night he saw a man next to him in a chair. That man was not black or white. He was light brown skinned with oily black hair. He says he looked right in Malcolm's face and he knew he wasn't dreaming. He said neither of the two spoke to each other, and he says, quote, "As suddenly as he had came, he was gone," end quote. Later he'll say that he believes that this is W.D. Fard. Malcolm says, quote, "Little did I realize the day would come when Elijah Muhammad would be accused of his own sins of being guilty of the same acts of immorality that he judged Reginald and so many others for," end quote. Malcolm says, quote, "That day, as far as I'm concerned, everything in my brother Reginald had done is wrong," end quote. Reginald continued to visit. Malcolm noticed that Reginald's attire was declining. He used to wear suits and now he's wearing t-shirts and sneakers. Malcolm says he was, quote, "on the way down," end quote. He said that Reginald had to walk from Detroit to Boston, and he walked to Ella's house from Detroit, something that he heard. He said that he felt that this was punishment for going against Elijah Muhammad, punishment from Allah. Malcolm started to grow a beard in jail. He said his brother Reginald starts to believe that he himself is Allah. Reginald is put into a mental institution, and Malcolm believes Reginald was used by Allah to bring him to Islam. But later Malcolm felt that Reginald went insane because his family turned on him for Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm says that having a vision of someone before you see them is a prevision. He says, quote, "I would later believe that my prevision was of Master W.D. Fard, the Messiah," end quote. Malcolm's last year of prison was served back in Charleston Prison. He was sent from Norfolk Colony for refusal to take a medical shot. He says that he was worried about getting parole and how reading with the hallway light had damaged his eyes and he developed an astigmatism. He says this is when he has to get his first pair of glasses. Malcolm says that there was not much freedom in Charleston. He said this was a much more strict prison. A lot of Negroes in Charleston attended Bible class. Conducting the class was what he called, quote unquote, the perfect devil. He was a Harvard seminary student And Malcolm challenged him on the color of Jesus. He talks about this being a successful challenge and something that the people talk about in jail. And Malcolm used this as an opportunity to introduce the Negroes to Elijah Muhammad. And that's the end of chapter 12. Make sure you share this if you like what you heard. Make sure you read the book yourself. Visit malcolmxfoundation.org if you'd like to make a donation. And if you disagree with anything I said, put it in the comments. Other than that, I'll see y'all in chapter 12. Peace out.